"Step back, sir. This is community property," one of the officers said, his hand hovering near his belt. And there I was, in my own driveway, lit up by the strobing red and blue lights like some suburban criminal. Margaret Simmons, our HOA president and self-appointed sheriff of the cul-de-sac, stood just beyond the cruiser's headlights, pearls glinting with every indignant tilt of her chin. Clipboard clutched to her chest, she looked like she was about to personally write me a ticket. Now, if you've never lived under the thumb of a homeowners association, let me paint the picture. Imagine paying monthly fees for the privilege of being micromanaged. The color of your shutters? Approved. The height of your grass? Monitored. The angle of your trash can lid? Debated at meetings. And Margaret thrived in that environment. She was the kind of woman who'd treat a bylaw violation like a felony. The showdown started earlier that evening. I had just pulled into my driveway after a long day at work, parked my truck, and grabbed my bag of takeout. My plan was simple: eat, shower, bed. But when I stepped back outside to grab a forgotten drink from the cooler in the cab, Margaret was already there, hovering like a hawk. "You can't park here," she snapped, pointing at my truck as though I'd abandoned it in the middle of the street. "This is community property. Driveways are for temporary loading only." I blinked at her, stunned. "Margaret, this is my driveway. It's literally on the deed." She shook her head with that smug, queenly air she always carried. "Your deed is subject to HOA governance. Vehicles must be moved after 30 minutes. That's in the handbook." Now, I had read that handbook cover to cover, usually with a glass of whiskey in hand for courage. There was nothing in there about 30-minute parking limits on driveways. Margaret just had a habit of inventing rules and hoping nobody checked. I should have ignored her. Should have just gone inside, locked the door, and let her rant at the night air, but something in her tone, the way she looked at me like I was trespassing on my own land, ignited a spark. "I'm not moving my truck," I said, calm but firm, and that's when she called the police. Fast forward 20 minutes, and my quiet cul-de-sac looked like a crime scene. Neighbors peeked through curtains, porch lights flicked on, and kids pressed their noses to fogged-up windows. Margaret gave her statement to the officers, her voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "This man is in violation of HOA code," she said, pearls bouncing as she gestured wildly. "He's parked in a restricted zone. He refused a direct order from the board. He is trespassing. Trespassing. On my own driveway." Even the younger officer raised an eyebrow at that one. I kept my cool, though my pulse was thudding in my ears. "Officer," I said evenly, "would you like to see my property access pass?" Margaret laughed, sharp and triumphant. "He doesn't have one. That's why he hides his truck at night." I reached into my wallet and slid out the laminated card, stamped, signed, and valid. The older officer took it, examined it under his flashlight, and then looked back at Margaret. "Ma'am, this is legitimate. His vehicle is registered, and he's clearly within his rights to park here." The silence that followed was delicious. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish out of water. For a moment, I thought she might actually faint right there on the sidewalk. But, of course, Margaret wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully. She straightened her robe, smoothed her clipboard papers, and narrowed her eyes at me. "This isn't over," she hissed, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "There are other violations." The officers gave me a nod, almost apologetic, before returning to their cruiser. The lights dimmed, the engine hummed, and soon the street was quiet again. Except for Margaret, who lingered just long enough to ensure every curtain in the neighborhood saw her retreat. I stood in the cool night air, the smell of cut grass mixing with the faint tang of exhaust, and felt the knot of adrenaline in my chest loosen. I had won this round, but Margaret's words clung to me like a warning. Other violations. She would comb through that handbook, invent new interpretations, and plaster me with fine after fine. I could already imagine the bright yellow envelopes, the bold red stamps, the smug smirk when she handed me final notices. As I walked back inside, pass still clutched in my hand, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the fight. This was just Margaret's opening move, and I was already planning mine. The envelope screamed at me in big, red letters, "Final Notice." There it was, slapped onto my front door with enough tape to survive a hurricane, like some suburban version of a scarlet letter. My stomach dropped, though not from fear, more from the absurdity, because I already knew who was behind it. Margaret Simmons had struck again. The morning sun hadn't even fully climbed over the rooftops yet. Sprinklers hissed across manicured lawns, dogs barked in distant yards, and there I stood in pajama bottoms and bare feet, peeling this bright yellow HOA envelope off my door like it was a parking ticket. Neighbors walking their labradoodles slowed down, gave me sympathetic smiles, and whispered to each other. Margaret didn't need a gossip column. Her drama wrote itself in bold print and red ink. I ripped the envelope open right there on the porch. "Notice of non-compliance," it read in officious block letters. The list of violations was laughable. Failure to move vehicle within 30 minutes of driveway use. Unauthorized lawn ornament. Apparently my bird feeder counted. Unapproved curtain color. My beige blinds were apparently the wrong shade of beige. At the bottom, a bold demand. Total fines owed. $475, payable immediately. I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out sharp and bitter. Margaret had gone from calling the police to conjuring fines out of thin air. I pictured her the night before, hunched over her desk with a magnifying glass, pearls clinking against her coffee mug as she scribbled down violations, like a detective cracking a case. Still, the word "final notice" gnawed at me. It suggested earlier warnings I'd never seen. Margaret had skipped straight to the grand finale, like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a hat and declaring the trick complete. I knew I couldn't just ignore it. Fines had a way of piling up, and Margaret was the type to escalate, collections, liens, maybe even dragging me to a hearing just to watch me squirm. So I did what she never expected. I went back inside, poured myself a strong coffee, and pulled out my copy of the HOA handbook. Now, this handbook wasn't exactly beach reading. It was 3-ring bound, printed in size 10 font, and smelled faintly of mildew. But I spread it out across the kitchen table like it was treasure map. If Margaret was going to play lawyer, I was going to be judge and jury. I flipped to the section on vehicles. Driveways must remain accessible and free from obstruction. That was it. Nothing about 30-minute limits, nothing about temporary use. She had twisted one vague line into her own personal law. The bird feeder, the handbook explicitly said, no permanent fixtures or structures may be installed without approval. My feeder was a pole stuck in the ground. Removable. Temporary. Completely allowed. And the curtains? Don't get me started. The handbook didn't even regulate interiors. It only said external paint colors must be approved. My blinds weren't even visible unless you pressed your nose against the glass. Every accusation was smoke and mirrors. Margaret's so-called violations had no teeth. Later that day, while I was mowing the lawn, my neighbor Dan wandered over. He leaned against the fence, beer in hand, despite it being barely noon. "I see you got one of Margaret's love notes," he said, nodding at the crumpled envelope sitting on my porch table. "Final notice," I said, cutting the mower engine. "She's trying to charge me nearly $500. Dan barked out a laugh. She did the same thing to the Rodriguezes last year. Claimed their kids' chalk drawings violated the defacement of property clause. They fought it and won. She's obsessed. That word, obsessed, hung in the air. Margaret didn't just enforce rules. She manufactured them, wielding her clipboard like a sword and her pearls like armor. I thanked Dan and went back to trimming the hedges, but my mind was already racing. This wasn't about fines. It wasn't about driveways or bird feeders or beige curtains. Margaret needed to prove she was in control, and she was using me as her example. By sunset, I had my plan. I gathered every page of her bogus notice, stacked them neatly, and slid them into a binder alongside photocopies of the actual handbook clauses. If she wanted a war of paper, I was ready to drown her in ink. That night, as cicadas buzzed in the trees and porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood, I sat on my front steps and imagined the look on her face when I presented her with her own words twisted back against her. I pictured her pearls rattling as she sputtered, her clipboard trembling as the neighbors realized she was bluffing all along. But just as I let that satisfying vision settle, another thought crept in. Margaret wouldn't fold easily. She wouldn't retreat quietly into her rose bushes. No, she'd double down, escalate, and drag the entire neighborhood into her crusade if she had to. I flipped the final notice envelope in my hands one last time. On the back, scribbled in her neat looping handwriting, was a line she hadn't meant for the official record. Bring your checkbook to the next meeting. And right then, I knew exactly where this was headed. The real showdown wasn't going to happen on my porch. It was going to happen in that fluorescent-lit HOA meeting room, and Margaret would be waiting. "Escort him out," Margaret snapped, pearls rattling as she jabbed her pen in my direction. "He's in violation of every code we stand for." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the folding tables and plastic chairs of our HOA meeting room. A dozen neighbors stared, some curious, some exhausted, a few openly entertained. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and copier ink, and the tension was thick enough to choke on. Margaret stood at the head of the room like a monarch at court, gripping her clipboard as though it were a gavel. But instead of panicking, I slid a neat stack of papers across the table. "You mean these rules?" I asked calmly. Every signature, every official stamp, every clause highlighted in yellow. The gasp that went around the room was better than any standing ovation. Now, let me rewind, because this meeting had been brewing for weeks. After the final notice debacle, Margaret had plastered more envelopes on my door. Alleged violations piled up, grass half an inch too long, trash cans placed too close to the curb, porch light too bright after hours. It got to the point where I could set my watch by her evening patrols, clipboard tucked under her arm, robe trailing as she stalked from driveway to driveway. Neighbors were divided. Some nodded at her, fearful she might turn her wrath on them next. Others whispered their frustrations at block parties, shaking their heads at how far she'd gone. By the time the quarterly meeting rolled around, the entire street buzzed with anticipation. Would Margaret finally go too far? The meeting room itself looked like a school cafeteria repurposed for battle. A banner with the HOA's motto, "Community First," hung crookedly on the wall. The folding tables formed a horseshoe, with the board members on one side and the rest of us in plastic chairs facing them. Margaret presided in the center seat, pearls gleaming under the harsh lights, hair sprayed so stiff it could withstand a tornado. "First order of business," she began, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "The matter of Mr. Walker's repeated non-compliance." Every head swiveled toward me. I sat there in my best button-down shirt, a binder balanced on my lap, heart thudding but face calm. Margaret wasted no time. She launched into a tirade, listing violations like a prosecutor at trial. Unauthorized lawn fixture, vehicle storage violations, disrupting the peace. This man has shown blatant disregard for our bylaws. I move that we fine him the maximum amount and restrict his voting privileges. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered, "Didn't he just park in his driveway?" But Margaret wasn't finished. She turned to the two off-duty police officers she'd invited as community liaisons. "If he refuses to comply," she declared, "I ask that he be escorted out for trespassing." And that's where I slid the paperwork onto the table. "Actually," I said, keeping my tone polite, almost casual, "I think the board should see this first." I opened the binder to the vehicle section of the handbook. Highlighted, tabbed, and neatly copied. The line about driveways being free from obstruction. No 30-minute rule. No clause about registered vehicles being removed. I flipped the page to the section on lawn ornaments. Nothing prohibiting bird feeders. Then to the bylaws about home interiors. Curtains never mentioned once. "This," I said, tapping the stamped access pass at the back of the binder, "is my registration, signed by this very board 2 years ago. Every so-called violation Margaret has cited is either invented or misrepresented." The room was silent for a beat. Then a low hum of voices filled the space. Neighbors leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Board members shuffled in their seats, suddenly unsure. Margaret's face flushed crimson. She clutched her clipboard tighter, pearls trembling against her throat. "He is twisting the language," she hissed. "The spirit of the rules." "Margaret," one of the board members cut in, his tone weary, "the spirit of the rules doesn't hold up in court. The bylaws are the bylaws." Another board member, Mrs. Lee, leaned forward. "I don't see any violation here. If anything, this looks like harassment." That word, harassment, spread through the room like wildfire. A few neighbors nodded. Dan from across the street let out a low whistle. Even the off-duty officers looked less like they were preparing to drag me out, and more like they were waiting for this circus to end. For the first time, Margaret faltered. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She shuffled her papers, glanced at her allies on the board, and realized no one was stepping in to save her. And that's when the tide turned. The same neighbors who had once cowered under her patrols now saw cracks in her armor. The woman who had ruled the cul-de-sac with fines and citations was suddenly cornered, exposed by her own rule book. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding, but outwardly calm. "So," I asked lightly, "should we move on to the next order of business?" The board shuffled awkwardly, muttered agreement, and the gavel came down. Margaret sat rigid, eyes fixed on me, her jaw tight with fury. The meeting limped on, but the power dynamic had shifted. Everyone could feel it. As neighbors filed out afterward, a few clapped me on the back, whispered, "Nice work," or simply smiled. But I caught the look in Margaret's eyes as she packed up her clipboard, cold, calculating, unbroken. Her reign had collapsed tonight, yes, but a woman like Margaret didn't go quietly, and as she brushed past me, pearls clicking against each other like teeth, she muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "This isn't finished."